The morning after my husband's funeral, my father-in-law walked into the boardroom and sat in my husband's chair. He placed a stack of papers in front of me. From today, this company is mine. Sign the papers or I'll see you in court. My lawyer squeezed my hand under the table and said, "Don't even think about it." I looked at the documents, then at the man who had just buried his own son, and I slid the papers back toward him. "Make sure everything's ready. I'll sign." Everyone in that room thought I had just destroyed my own future. They had no idea what was already in motion.
But before I tell you what I actually did, take a second to like and subscribe, because this story, it only gets worse before it gets better. My name is Alina Hayes. I'm 32 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was the wife of Daniel Hayes, the man who built Hayes Industrial from nothing. We live in a small town in Ohio, the kind of town where everyone knows who owns the biggest building, and that building, with the tall glass windows and blue company logo, belonged to my husband. Daniel didn't come from money. He built the company from a tiny rented warehouse with 2 broken machines and 1 worker who almost quit the first week. 10 years later, Hayes Industrial supplied parts to factories in 3 different states. It wasn't just a company. It was Daniel's life. And that's why what happened still feels unreal. 3 months ago, Daniel died in an accident at the warehouse. A machine malfunctioned, something went wrong. By the time the ambulance came, it was too late. He was 35 years old. 1 minute he was texting me about dinner, the next I was identifying his body. I didn't even have time to understand my grief, because the day after the funeral, Richard Hayes, my father-in-law, decided he had waited long enough. Richard always believed the company was his, not legally, but in his mind. He helped Daniel in the beginning, gave advice, introduced him to 1 or 2 people, and he never let anyone forget it. At family dinners, he would say things like, "If it wasn't for me, there wouldn't be a Hayes Industrial." Daniel would just smile and change the subject. I never liked the way Richard looked at me, like I was temporary, like I didn't belong in the picture. The funeral was on a Sunday. By Monday morning, Richard was at the company office at 8 a.m. By Tuesday, he had called a board meeting, and by Wednesday, he had lawyers. He claimed Daniel had promised the company would stay in the bloodline. He said I didn't understand business. He told the board members I was emotional, unstable, not fit to lead. The worst part? Some of them believed him. I had never raised my voice in a meeting before. I had never fought for control. I was always Daniel's wife, soft-spoken, polite, quiet. So when Richard threatened court, the room went silent. My lawyer later told me we could fight. It would take months, maybe years. It would cost a lot. It would be ugly. And Richard was ready for war. But as I sat there in that chair, watching him take over my husband's desk, listening to him talk about legacy and family name, I didn't feel anger. I felt calm. The kind of calm that scares people. Because while Richard thought he was stepping into power, he had no idea what Daniel had done 6 months before he died. And that's where the story really begins. 6 months before the accident, Daniel came home later than usual. He didn't look angry. He didn't look scared. He looked disappointed. I remember asking him, "Bad day?" He sat at the kitchen table for a long time before answering. "I trusted the wrong person," he finally said. At first, I thought he was talking about a client, or maybe a supplier. He wasn't. He was talking about his father. Richard had been slowly getting more involved in the company, not officially, just helping, giving advice, asking for reports, suggesting changes. Daniel respected him. He always did. But that day, Daniel found something that changed everything. Small payments. Money leaving the company account in strange ways. Nothing huge, nothing dramatic, just small amounts, again and again. When Daniel asked about it, Richard brushed it off. Business expenses, consulting adjustments, temporary transfers. But the numbers didn't add up. Daniel hired a private accountant to check quietly. And what they found was simple. Money had been moved without proper approval. Not millions, but enough. Enough to break trust. That night, Daniel didn't yell. He didn't confront his father again. He just made a decision. "If something ever happens to me," he told me,
I don't want you depending on him." I laughed at him back then. "Nothing is going to happen to you," I said. He just smiled. But he had already started planning. Over the next few months, Daniel began doing things I didn't fully understand at the time. He met with a lawyer, not the company lawyer, a different one. He opened a new company, quietly, a small LLC, not under his name, under mine. When I asked him why, he said, "Just in case." Just in case. Those 3 words mean something very different now. Daniel slowly moved new client contracts into the new company. Not the old big contracts, just the important ones, the long-term ones, the steady ones. He also changed supplier agreements. The suppliers didn't mind. To them, it was just paperwork. The name on the contract changed, the payment structure changed. That's it. Richard didn't notice. Why would he? The building was still there, the machines were still running, the brand name was still Hayes Industrial. Everything looked normal. But the heart of the business was quietly moving. Daniel also made sure something else was clear. If anything ever happened to him, ownership of the new company would automatically stay with me. No vote, no board approval, no argument, just mine. At the time, I thought he was overthinking, being dramatic, planning for something that would never happen. I never imagined I would be sitting in a boardroom months later, listening to his father threaten me with court. After Daniel died, I found the folder in our home office. It wasn't hidden. It was organized. Clean. Contracts, documents, transfer agreements, everything legal, everything signed, everything ready. I didn't cry when I read it. I didn't panic. I just understood. Daniel didn't fight his father. He prepared. And now, sitting in that boardroom with Richard smiling like he had already won, I knew something he didn't. The company he was trying to take was no longer what he thought it was. And that's why when my lawyer whispered, "Don't sign," I already knew I would. Because sometimes, the best way to win is to let someone believe they already have.
I signed the papers the next morning. No shaking hands, no tears, no hesitation. Richard smiled the entire time. When the final document was stamped, he stood up and shook hands with the board members like he had just closed the biggest deal of his life. "Family business," he said proudly, "back where it belongs." I walked out of that building without looking back. By the end of that week, Richard officially became CEO of Hayes Industrial. He moved into Daniel's office. He replaced Daniel's photo on the desk with one of himself shaking hands with a supplier from 10 years ago. He called a company-wide meeting. From what I heard later, he stood in front of the workers and said, "Nothing will change. We're stronger than ever." The workers clapped. Some of them looked unsure. Daniel had hired most of those people himself. He knew their kids' names. He remembered their birthdays. Richard didn't even know who worked in accounting. But confidence can look like leadership, at least at first. The first week went smoothly. Orders were still being delivered, machines were still running, trucks were still leaving the warehouse. Richard walked around like a king inspecting his kingdom. He called a local newspaper and gave an interview about continuing his son's legacy. He told people he stepped in to protect the company. He enjoyed the attention. But then, week 2 arrived. Richard was sitting in Daniel's office when the sales manager walked in. He looked nervous. "Sir, something's wrong." Richard didn't look up. "What is it now?" "Our biggest clients haven't sent their next orders." Richard frowned. "They always place orders this week." "Yes, sir, but this time, nothing came in." Richard told the team to call them. So they called the first major client. The client answered calmly. "Oh, we're not ordering from you anymore." The manager froze. "What do you mean?" "We signed a new long-term contract months ago. We've already been placing our orders." "With who?" the manager asked quietly. There was a short pause. "With the new company." The line went silent. Richard grabbed the phone and called another client himself. Same answer. Then another. Same answer. All of them had already moved their contracts months before Daniel died. They weren't waiting. They weren't confused. They had already switched. The money wasn't late. It just wasn't coming to Hayes Industrial anymore.
Then Richard called one of the main suppliers. The supplier sounded surprised. "Sir, we updated the agreement months ago. We now deliver under the new contract." "What contract?" Richard demanded. "The updated one Daniel signed before his accident." Richard asked for copies. They sent them immediately. Every paper was real. Every signature was legal. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was fake. It had all been done properly. That's when Richard finally understood something. He owned the building. He owned the machines. But the business had already moved on. And I still hadn't said a single word. I was just waiting. Week 3. Payroll, didn't he? The cash reserve wasn't what Richard expected. Without the major client payments coming in, the numbers were tighter. Much tighter. He dipped into the company savings. Then he scheduled an emergency board meeting. He accused the former management of sabotage. One board member quietly asked, "Wasn't Elena part of management?" Richard's jaw tightened. "She walked away," he snapped. But I hadn't walked away. I had stepped aside. There's a difference. By the end of week 3, Richard finally asked the question he should have asked on day 1. Where exactly are the long-term contracts? And that's when someone placed a folder on his desk. The folder had my company's name on it. And for the first time, Richard Hayes stopped smiling.
He opened it slowly. Inside were copies of contracts, signed months ago, customer agreements, supply agreements, transfer papers, all dated before Daniel died. Richard's face turned pale. "This isn't possible," he said. But it was. One board member cleared his throat. "These contracts are legal, Richard. They were filed properly." Richard flipped through the pages faster. Each signature was real. Each date was clear. Daniel had moved the most important clients, the long-term ones, the steady income ones. Not loudly, not suddenly, quietly. Richard stood up from the chair. "That doesn't matter," he snapped. "We still have the company." But the numbers on the screen behind him said something else. Without those contracts, the monthly income dropped almost in half. Payroll was coming up, rent on the warehouse was due, loan payments were scheduled, and the next big order wasn't coming. By week 3, the problem became visible. The production floor was quieter. Fewer trucks were leaving the building. Workers started whispering. One supervisor asked, "Are we losing clients?" Richard told everyone to stay focused. He blamed temporary market changes. But the board wasn't relaxed anymore. They had seen the folder. They had seen the dates. They had seen my name. Then the bank called. The company had a business loan. Without steady contract income, the bank wanted updated financial reports. Richard tried to sound confident. "It's a short-term issue," he told them. But banks don't care about confidence. They care about numbers. And the numbers were shrinking. 2 more clients officially confirmed they had already moved their business months ago. Everything had been planned. Everything had been signed. Everything had been legal. Richard finally did what he should have done on day 1. He called a lawyer. He demanded they reverse the contracts. The lawyer reviewed everything. Then he gave Richard the answer he didn't want. There's nothing to reverse. The contracts were moved legally before Daniel passed away. Richard slammed his desk on the table. He had no right. The lawyer replied calmly, "He absolutely did. He was the owner." That night, Richard drove to my house. He didn't call first. He didn't warn me. He just showed up. I opened the door slowly. He looked different. Not powerful, not proud, just angry. "What did you do?" he demanded. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I just looked at him. "I signed the papers," I said calmly, "just like you wanted." He stepped closer. "You think this is funny?" "No," I said softly. "I think it's fair." He stared at me, trying to understand, but he still didn't fully see it. He thought this was an accident, a mistake, a coincidence. He didn't realize yet that Daniel had never planned to leave the future in his father's hands, and this was only the beginning. Within a month, everything started falling apart. The company still had the building, it still had the machines, it still had the name, but it didn't have enough work.
Without the long-term contracts, the money coming in was unstable. Some weeks were okay. Most were not. Payroll became stressful. Richard had to use company savings to pay workers. Then the savings ran low. The bank requested updated financial reports again. This time, they didn't like what they saw. Revenue had dropped sharply. Future projections looked weak. The bank warned him that if things didn't improve, they could review the loan terms. That scared him. Then one of the board members resigned. Quietly. He didn't want to be part of a sinking ship. Workers started looking for other jobs. A few of the best managers left first. They knew how business worked. They could see the numbers. Richard tried to fix it. He called old clients, begging them to reconsider. They politely refused. Their contracts were already signed. Their deliveries were already running smoothly. There was no reason to go back. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I didn't post anything online. I didn't make public announcements. I just worked. The new company Daniel had created was small, but it was stable. The clients trusted us. The suppliers already knew the system. Slowly, I hired a few former employees who had left Richard's company. Not out of revenge, out of opportunity. They needed stability. I could offer it. 3 months after Richard took control, the board called an emergency meeting. They voted to remove him as CEO. The company wasn't profitable enough. The risk was too high. Richard lost the title he fought so hard to get. But the problems didn't disappear. The debts were still there. The building still needed maintenance. The loans still needed payments. And without steady contracts, the future looked uncertain. One evening, Richard came to see me again. This time, he didn't shout. He didn't threaten court. He didn't demand anything. He just looked tired. "You planned this," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "Daniel did." He didn't argue, because deep down, he knew it was true. Daniel had seen the warning signs. Daniel had prepared. Daniel had protected me. Richard thought he was fighting for legacy, but legacy isn't about control. It's about care. Daniel didn't care about the building. He didn't care about the logo. He cared about stability, about security, about making sure I would never have to beg anyone for survival. Richard wanted the company name, so I let him have it. I kept what truly mattered. Today, I run the new company. It's not flashy, it's not loud, but it's strong, stable, growing. Sometimes I drive past the old warehouse. The sign still says Hayes Industrial, but the parking lot is never as full as it used to be. And every time I see it, I remember the day Richard told me to sign or go to court. I remember how everyone thought I was weak. And I remember Daniel's quiet smile the night he said, "Just in case." Sometimes the smartest move isn't to fight. It's to step aside and let someone else carry the weight they demanded.